Hey everyone, today we're going to be ranking every organic trait in Stellaris. So let's go ahead and jump straight into the tier list and I'll break down why each one belongs where it does. In the F tier, I have Slow Breeders, Repugnant, Inorganic Breath, Agrarian, Noxious, and Nomadic. In the D tier, I have Docile, Psychological Infertility, Communal, Resilient, Talented, Very Strong, Extremely Adaptive, Decadent, Fleeting, Slow Learners, Weak, Gaseous Byproducts, Scintillating Skin, Spare Organs, Volatile Excretions. In the C tier, we have Quick Learners, Unruly, Conservationists, Traditional, Adaptive, Conformists, Venerable, Wasteful, Phototropic, Flight, Invasive Species, Seasoned Dormancy, Nascent Stage, Brittle, Chromalogs, and Hollow Bones. In the B tier, we have Natural Sociologists, Charismatic, Existential Iteroparity, Incubators, Ingenious, Thrifty, Deviants, Quarrelsome, Acidic Vascularity, Aquatic, Budding, Crystallization, Egg-laying, Familial, Genetic Memory, Shelled, Spatial Mastery, and Permeable Skin. In the A tier, we have Enduring, Natural Physicists, Strong, Industrious, Rapid Breeders, Jinxed, Solitary, Non-Adaptive, Camouflage, and Radiotrophic. And lastly, in the S tier, we have Sedentary, Intelligent, Natural Engineers, and Rooted. Okay, so now that we have the executive summary out of the way, let's go ahead and backtrack a bit. To discuss what the video will be about in depth, we are currently on the Lyra 4.1.5 update. This tier list is going to be explicitly for PvE. If you take this into consideration for PvP, it's going to change. So for now, just keep in mind that this is meant for PvE. And as you saw previously from the executive summary, there was no robotic traits. There's not going to be any robotic traits in this tier list. This is specifically just organic traits. With that being said, we will make a robotic tier list in a separate video. Alright, with those things out of the way, let's go ahead and start breaking down each organic trait one by one, starting from the top. So Communal, I have as a D tier. Pop housing usage minus 10% for a 1 cost. In my opinion, housing is never really a problem on my planets. It seems that most buildings nowadays are providing some sort of housing allowance with their building on their completion. I don't really see taking this as a good choice when it's easy to get around housing issues, especially through the traders that will randomly give you bunk beds or some sort of housing complex that allows for housing usage to go down. Up next, we have Conservationists. 1 cost for reducing pop consumer goods by 10%. I put this at a C tier. Arguably a B tier, but I'm slotting it as a C tier. I think this is going to be pretty mid for most things. It's not a terrible pick, but it's also not a great pick. But, you know, reducing pop consumer goods can be great because this is kind of the one hard thing that it is to balance in the game. So I can see this being moved up to B tier in some situations, but from my experience, it's pretty easy to get around it when you can just build another civilian fabricators. Up next, we have Enduring, a 1 cost for a leader lifespan of 20 years plus. This is going to allow you to maintain senior leaders who have earned their perks longer instead of losing them and having to restart and losing all those perks, especially with the new leadership update and making leaders more interactive and you can choose what traits they get and what perks they have. This has become a much higher level pick in my opinion, thus I'm putting it as an A tier, especially for 1 cost. You know, you're going to be able to last 20 years longer and maybe even more than that based off the technologies that you choose. Natural Engineers, a 1 cost for 15% job efficiency for engineering jobs. As you can see here, engineering jobs include these 3 things right here. In my opinion, engineering tech is usually some of the strongest things, and it's the thing that actually upgrades your fleet. And of course, upgrading your fleet is very important because you want to be able to fight, you want to get to those battleships, all that good stuff. Naturally, you want to have this tech type above the other 2, above physics and above sociology. So in my opinion, this is an S tier because of how strong engineering tech is naturally, especially if you're trying to get for the mega structures as well. You always want to be rushing those things. Up next, natural physicists, basically increasing job efficiency 15% for physicists jobs. This is going to go into the A tier. I find physics research between engineering and sociology, so it's going to help you in both civil and military applications. Not a bad choice. That's why it's A tier. For one cost, I think it's pretty good. And up next, we have the Natural Sociologist. This is the lowest tier in the hierarchy of techs, in my opinion. For one cost, you get 15% job efficiency in biologist jobs. I put this as a B tier, so you can kind of see, you know, S tier for engineers, A tier for the physicists, and B tier for sociologists. Don't mean to upset any of these sociologists or physicists, but that's just how the game is. So that's how I see it. I do think that this is more civilian leaning, but obviously you want to improve your society, right? So still high tier, don't get me wrong, B tier is great, but you know, it's not quite A tier and definitely not S tier. Up next, we have Nomadic. This is our first F tier trait we have. A minus 35% resettlement cost for one cost. I'm not sure how often people are manually resettling, so I can see it for having some use in very specific, like extremely specific scenarios, like the Doomsday Origin, where you need to relocate ASAP. Otherwise, I just feel like you just need to let resettlement automatically happen and do its own thing. You don't have to micromanage your things unless, you know, you're really into that and you want to really have that, oh, I want to put these pops here and I want to put that pop there. But I mean, you're losing one trait pick and a point for, you know, 35% less cost, which, I mean, really, it's usually just energy, and energy is pretty easy to come by. So in my opinion, I still think this is F tier, even if, you know, even in those very specific scenarios, it might move up to, you know, highest C tier, but I can't see it going higher than that. And believe it or not, back to back, we have another F tier, Noxious. This is such an interesting selection, because look how many things are coming in this one cost trait. It's almost overwhelming how many things you have. You have minimum habitability floor of 30%, but your cap is reduced by 30%. So the floor for you is 30, but the cap is 70 technically. Your army damage is increased, but you have increased housing usage. Happiness to non-noxious pops is minus 1%, and happiness per non-noxious pops is up, so you can get a maximum of 40. It's 2%. Your happiness increases per non-noxious pop by 2% to a max of 40. I have this as F tier, but there's a very, very, very extreme niche use for this, and I cannot understate this. I could see this being used in some sort of necrophage or xenophobic build where your elite leaders and elite jobs are benefiting far more than the subservient population or slave population that you're taking over for different worlds. This would allow your overlord species to take over other planets and live there without issue due to this floor that you have here. Obviously the cap doesn't help, but the floor is what's going to make it so you can live there and have habitability bonuses. Again, extremely niche use for that very specific build. If you do have that, I would say that this could possibly be you know, anywhere from B to A tier, maybe even S tier depending on the build. But it's just, I don't want to put it that high for most people. That's why I'm keeping it as an F tier for most people. Up next, we have Quick Learners. I'm putting this as C tier, arguably a B tier, but I'm keeping this as C tier because this is great for leader-driven builds. And like I said before, the fact that leaders have been revamped, this is going to be placed higher than it normally would. If you focused on just a leadership build, this will obviously move up in the tier list. For one cost, you get 10% more leadership experience gain, which in the grand scheme of things, probably won't amount to much for the first few levels, but when you get into the later levels, when it's harder to level up, it's going to add up quicker. Up next, we have Resilient. Resilient is an extremely niche use. I put this at a D tier. This is only going to work if you're in a defensive battle on your planets. So it's only if you have a war that's one coming into your planets and two actually attacking your planets instead of just your fleets. Otherwise, I don't really see this being used because of how niche this actually is to use. It's actually pretty rare for someone to attack your planets, but when it does come into play, it's great, right? So, but even at a one cost, I don't see this being used too often. Could be really good for some peaceful civilizations or even tall build civilizations that you know, are isolationist or peaceful, But aside from that, I would probably stay away from this one. Up next, we have Strong, and Strong is an A tier, and there's a reason why, because in the other version of this called Very Strong, it's a 4 cost for only double the amount of this. So in my opinion, that makes Strong, so if we scroll down to Very Strong, sorry, it's a 3 cost, not a 4 cost. It's a 3 cost for 40% army damage and 5% workers and drone job efficiency. But it's a 1 cost for 20% army damage and 2.5% worker and drone efficiency. In my opinion, that makes it a really good deal because not only are you getting half the benefits for less than half the cost, these are things that can come into play. It's not just defensive army damage, it's regular army damage. So that's going to be used a lot more. And obviously this one is going to be used every day. A 2.5% is going to be affecting all of your populations pretty much. Or at least all your planets. I shouldn't say all your populations, but all your planets. 2.5% might not look like much, but it's going to add up quickly, especially later game. Talented, I'm putting this at a D tier. And you're probably thinking, well, hey, this is a leadership-centric trait. It's like, yes, absolutely, you're right. It is a leadership-centric trait. And I've been saying how important leaders are in this meta with the leadership update. I just think that upkeep isn't really a big deal. I mean, usually it's like, 2 unity per month to have them as upkeep, so you're reducing them by 0.2 per leader. So I mean, if you have 10 leaders, that's 2 unity that you're saving for 1 trait. The maximum negative perk trait is nice, but that's going off of like a probability thing anyways, so you have to first of all, you have to hit the cap of negative traits in the first place for this to even come into effect. So it looks nice on paper, but like the probability of you actually hitting the ceiling of negative traits isn't as likely. But if you do have long-lived leaders or immortal leaders, this is going to be a higher tier for you, just because reducing that maximum negative trait for leaders that live really long is going to be really key for you. So think of builds that are leader-centric, like Necrophage, Under One Rule, Progenitor Hive, niche use, but under those uses, obviously moves it up far more up the ranked tier list. But for most players, if you're looking just for a general ranking, it's a D. Traditional, a 1 cost for a 10% increase to job efficiency for bureaucrats. So keep in mind, it's not 15 like we saw with the researchers. This is only 10. But bureaucrats do cover these jobs right here. It's good if you're looking for a Unity Rush build, if you're looking to rush traditions. Otherwise, it's kind of just okay. You know what I mean? Like, it's not going to be amazing, but it's not going to be terrible. So that's why it's slotted kind of in the middle of the road at a C tier. Moving on to the 2 costs, we have Adaptive for 10% habitability. This isn't a bad trade. I would take this if I need to push above a 70% habitability threshold, because low habitability can trigger events, so ideally you want to avoid being below 70%. Although most origins and traits should allow you to start at 80% anyways, there are some cases where you can be at 70% or even lower than that. So if that is a rare instance for you, I would end up taking this, or if you want to abuse some sort of over 100% habitability build, there are some instances or traits that have that. They have scaling habitability bonuses. Aside from that, not too many times you'll be taking this trait. If you want to get above 80% at the start, maybe you want to start with 90 just for an extra bonus to your planet. It's not a bad trade, but for 2 cost, I do think it is a lot. So that's why it's still at C tier. Up next, we got the Agrarian. Agrarian is F tier. This is a 2 cost for 15% job efficiency for farming jobs. Food is the least desirable resource in the game. In fact, there's many instances and buildings where they'll take food and change it into some other resource. That's how easy and wasteful this resource is. That's why it is an F tier. Usually, you don't really need a lot of work or maintenance to gather it, and you can even just build hydroponics bays in star bases to cover most food needs anyway. So I place this as F tier. I just don't really see farming being a very important thing compared to, say, minerals or energy credits. Up next, we got Charismatic. This is a B tier. It's 2 cost for 20% job efficiency, and you can see what jobs it covers. It covers elite jobs, entertainers, biotrophies, and maintenance drones. I would like to see this at a 1 cost for 10 or even 15%, but this being a 2 cost kind of limits it. However, it does cover a lot of jobs, and these jobs are pretty valuable for you, so I'm going to put this at B tier. Up next, we got Conformists, 2 cost for increasing unity, 30% governing ethics attraction. I personally don't see it's worth it, but I could see it, being good for slotting into some unity builds, or if you're tradition rushing, that's another thing too. I would like to see this at 1 cost for 20%. I think that'd be a better trade, but for it being 2 cost at 30%, I just don't see it like being higher tier until that trade happens. Up next, we have Docile. Docile is D tier. I find this to be a D tier because I think it being a 2 cost is a bit high. I mean, the Empire size from pops can help tremendously, but you're not going to really see it until mid or late game anyways, when that starts really affecting your traditions and your tech. But I just feel like it being a 2 cost is a little bit too high. I would like to see it at 1 cost for 7.5. I would even take 5%, but just 2 cost, it's a lot to give up for a trait. Now we have Existential Iteroparity. I think that's how you say it. I don't know. Anyways, I place this as a C tier. I think this is definitely a military-oriented civilization trait. Take this if you plan on fighting a lot, like determined exterminators, devouring swarms, all that good stuff, even necrophage too. But I don't place it higher than C because for most players you're going to want to be avoiding war, and wars can be very swingy unless you're very confident in that you could win the fight. Like if you see that they are inferior or pathetic level against you, then by all means go for it. But most games can be swingy. You don't even know if you're going to land next to an advanced AI or whatever. This can help towards the late game when the end game crisis appears, so 30% poth growth is nice. I just feel like, it being only available during wars and crisis kind of limits it, so I would place this as a C tier. Arguably much higher if you are, again, rushing a military civilization or looking to just have some sort of boost for your endgame. I could see it moving up in the list. Up next, Incubators 2 cost for a scaling pop growth speed depending on the inverse proportion of number of pops on the planet, not your empire, but on the planet. I was thinking this might slot lower, but the more I thought about it, it's 30% leaning positive and only 10% leaning negative. If it was 2020, this would be a lot lower. But I will say for the average person, it's not a bad choice. In fact, I think it's likely a good choice, and it has some potential on some S or even A tier usage depending on some rush builds. Because, when you first start, you're not going to have too many pops, so you're probably going to get ideally the maximum amount, which is 30. But I don't know where that floor is, so it's kind of hard to tell. I would not use this on tall builds though, because this leans heavily on rush builds and wide builds as it scales on each planet's population. And the question is that since it says planet, does that also mean habitats? I don't know. But if it does, it could be even better. Up next, we have Industrious. Industrious gives a 15% job efficiency for mining jobs. I put this as an A tier, and the reason why this is an A tier is that this is going to be super helpful for you to be able to build more stations, districts, buildings, etc. Because you're getting more minerals, and minerals are what allows you to build all those nice things, to build your orbit stations, to build buildings on your planets, and to sometimes even clear blockers. Just depends on what kind of blocker it is. So there's a lot of use for minerals, and especially early game when you're trying to build up things, this is going to be a very instrumental pick for most players. Extremely helpful to take on almost all builds, if not all builds. Up next, we have Ingenious, 2 cost for increasing technician jobs by a 15% job efficiency. I think this is good. It's a great overall pick, but it's not really A tier because energy is a bit easier to make compared to minerals. Minerals can be harder to harvest, whereas like energy, you can produce it in almost all places. It could be on star bases, it could be on planets, whereas minerals, you can't really just make those out of nothing. You have to like mine those. Up next, we have our S tier Intelligent, 2 cost for 10% job efficiency for researcher jobs. Ultimately, this is going to help you push for tech, and that's what wins games. The more tech you have, the better off your whole civilization is going to be. Better ships, better buildings, better societal rules, all that good stuff. So the more tech you can get, the faster you're going to be able to win. Up next, we have Rapid Breeders. This is an A tier, 2 cost for 10% pop growth. This won't be really noticeable early game, but mid and late game you're going to feel the effects of having larger populations. Adding any and all population growth is beneficial because pops in this game are superior. The more you have, the more resources you can make, the more armies you can get, all that good stuff. Up next, we have Thrifty. 25% job efficiency bonus for trader jobs. That's pretty big. I'm slotting it at B tier though. I think this is B tier because it's a pretty niche use, because not people are going to use trade. Most players are going to use trade, but not everyone is going to lock in on mercantile builds. This is a great pick for a mercantile build though. And I would say that this would scale pretty much all game. It's going to be a good selection for the whole game. Inorganic Breath. This is an F tier. This is a 3 cost that increases your pop upkeep by 50%. But for every 100 pops that's working as a slave or better, produces 0.02 exotic gases per month. That means that you need 10,000 population just to make 2 exotic gas. I mean, that's not a really great trade in my opinion. For increasing your upkeep for just 2 exotic gas every 10,000, I don't know, that just seems like a really bad deal to me. So I'm placing this F tier. I don't really see a point in taking this one, and it's a 3 cost on top of it all. Like I don't even know what they were thinking here. I think the only thing that has going for it is that there's no species limit on it, whereas like other things have limits. I think there's like Gaseous Byproduct that, you know, is limited to lithoids right here. 2 cost and it only produces 0.01. You're not producing as much, but still, I mean, like, at least there's not really negative. Yeah, the cost is high, but we'll get back into that one later. But I just don't really see taking this one, especially with the pop upkeep increase. That to me is like, doesn't really make sense, even for the added cost of 3. Up next, we have Very Strong, and I'm rating Very Strong at D tier. I know we had Strong much higher, but for a 3 cost at 40% army damage and 5% job efficiency for workers and menial drones, I would be hard pressed to select this one, just because it means that you're already selecting, you know, one trait that is going to blow your budget at 3 already. It's a really hard trade, especially when Strong is at a 1 cost in half of these. They need to reduce this cost to 2. I think if it was reduced to 2, it would probably be slotting in the B or C tier, around there, maybe even higher. But for right now, I'm placing this D tier. I just don't see where this would fit in, especially for how high the cost is. You know, you do get some great bonuses, don't get me wrong, but it's just I just find this cost too overwhelming. Extremely Adaptive, 20% habitability for 4 costs. That is massive. That's a massive cost. If this was a 3 cost, I could maybe see taking this, but at 4 costs, there's extremely niche uses when you would be taking this over Adaptive, where you have a really low habitability through some sort of origin or whatever. But even then, I would not be taking Extremely Adaptive in most builds. So I'm placing it D tier, arguably F tier, quite honestly. But I'm placing it D tier just because there are a few instances that this could actually be helpful. Venerable. I'm placing this at a C tier, and hear me out. This is a 4 cost, and it gives you 80 years added to your leader lifespan. This can make or break some builds given how influential leaders are due to the revamp. I imagine if you're going to utilize long-lived leaders traits and increase their level caps to gain even more traits, there's great synergy that can happen with this trait. Don't get me wrong. But the biggest thing that's holding this back is the massive 4 cost. If you can correctly play around your leaders, you're in the green. It's just for the average player, it's going to be really hard to capitalize on having this. When you see this, it's like, oh yeah, great. But you have to understand like what comes with this. There's a good reason why this is a 4 cost. It's because of how strong and how much potential there is behind leaders. If you can correctly pivot around leaders and build around leaders, you're going to be solid. This is a great pick. It's probably going to move up for you. Otherwise, this is going to be too much of a hit for most players, even with the boon. Decadent. I'm placing this as a D tier. I think a 10% happiness debuff is too large, and I don't see too many builds where this would slot in. Happiness is a really big thing for stability, for your world production. It just affects so many things, and to reduce that, I just don't really see this as a good thing. Up next, we have Deviance. This is going to be slotted at B tier. This is going to bring in people who disagree with your Civ's ideologies, and in the long run, it's going to slow down your Unity game. It actually used to be Influence, and this would have made it a much lower tier, but since it's only Unity, and only a 15% hit, which 15% of a percent, it's not that bad, but ultimately it's going to slow you down. I put it a B tier. Up next, Fleeting. 1 cost for minus 10 years on your leader lifespan. Can be annoying. I feel like long-term leaders are ideal, especially in this meta. You want to stack traits, and it affects so many things. You can have so many leaders now. Commanders, officials, scientists, all that good stuff. I would avoid this one if possible, so I'm putting it at D tier. I just don't think it's a great pick. Jinxed is interesting. I'm putting this at an A tier, and hear me out. If I'm reading this right, this only increases the cap of negative traits. It's not leaders start with negative traits. So if it's just raising the cap, the probability of leaders getting negative traits is already low, so you have to hit the ceiling in the first place for this to even come into effect, for your leaders to be like, okay, now it's time to add another negative trait. So I guess what I'm getting at is that for this to even affect you, it's going to be pretty low chance, unless you have leaders that are immortal or very long leader lifespans. You probably don't want to combine this with, really long-lived leaders in the first place. Up next, we got Quarrelsome. 1 cost for minus 10% job efficiency to bureaucrat jobs. Not a bad trade, since they only farm Unity. You can get it through other methods, but ultimately this is going to slow down your traditions. If you're Unity rushing, you want to avoid this. Ultimately, B tier. Up next, we have Sedentary. For a 1 cost, you have an increase of 35% resettlement cost. I'm placing this at an S tier, and the reason why this is an S tier is that resettlement can range from 500 energy for a big group of people to 1 energy to resettle pops, or it could be something else. But for how rare it is to resettle pops manually, I find this trait to be absolutely worth it. Up next, Slow Learners. 1 cost for minus 10% leadership experience gain. I'm placing this at a D tier. 10% leadership experience gain is more impactful than you think due to how many boons leaders can provide now. Even more so since they revamped the leaders, and now you can select traits and personally cater them to what you are trying to go for. Slowing this down can hurt you in the long run, so I would avoid this one. Up next, we have Solitary. Solitary is a 1 cost for 10% pop housing usage increase. I personally haven't run into any issues with housing in this patch. I think a 10% hit to pop housing usage wouldn't be terrible since it's a 1 cost. I find it a fair trade, all things considered. This is an A tier. With how easy it is to get housing, I just don't see this really becoming a problem. Wasteful is a 1 cost, a minus 1 cost, or a 10% increase on consumer good upkeep. This can make or break some builds because it might cause you to take up another building slot just to cover your increase, thus taking you away from other things that you're trying to do. Consumer goods can be a hard thing to balance, so I am placing the C tier. It just depends on what you're kind of going for here. And up next for the last minus 1 cost traits, we have Weak. Minus 20% army damage and minus 2.5% job efficiency for workers and menial drones. I'm placing this at a D tier. I personally think that they need to remove one of the nerfs because it feels like too much of a hit. If I could select, minus army damage or minus job efficiency, I feel like that'd be a better trade, but for both, it's just too much of a hit. When I know that there is strong available, which is the inverse of this, it's a 1 cost for 20% army damage and 2.5% job efficiency bonus. So that's a great thing to have. I think that's really strong, but for this to be a negative trait. I just find it, you know, too much of a hit for most people. Up next, we have non-adaptive. Non-adaptive is a conditional tier, and I'm placing it at A tier, assuming you already have over 100% habitability. Otherwise, this does not belong in A tier. It would most likely go to C or D tier. So for most players, I would say it's likely a C or D tier. I'm going to say a low C. But if you do have some sort of build, whether it's through origin or through other traits, where you can get at least 80% habitability, if not over 100%, I would place this as A tier. Typically, you would get higher habitability through techs, traditions, other things in game, so it's a bit more difficult to get 100% habitability right from the start. In either case, if you can get 100% habitability and you can suffer through the early game of losing habitability, even if you don't have that 100%, this is still a great -2 cost. Just note that lowering habitability increases upkeep, amenities usage, and decreases job effectiveness, and it also lowers your population growth. It's a dangerous double-edged sword to play, so be warned, only take this when you have high habitability. Psychological infertility. I'm placing this as D tier. I think that if you could become a likable civ, this is actually a great one to happen until a crisis happens. It scales well early and mid-game, but your late game, you're always going to suffer population growth because -30% during a crisis. You're going to be pretty much hit late game almost always. This might also apply to mid-game crisis like the Great Khan. So even mid-game this can suffer too, which is why it's a D tier. It's almost, in my opinion, almost an F tier. It's pretty low D tier. I still reserve for a niche use that it would go great for something like a mercantile build or some sort of diplomacy build where you're trying to make everyone your friend and you're not going to be really in any wars. So this is going to give you a -2 for your trait points, and you're not going to really suffer anything aside from possibly mid and also late game. However, note this is a slippery slope because it can be hard to avoid war, especially with how computers can react to any sudden change in borders or something that you changed in your traits or ethics they don't like, and all of a sudden they want to go at war with you because you don't align with what they are preaching. Repugnant, I am putting F tier. I think they nerfed this one because last time I don't recall this covering influential jobs. And influential jobs covers a lot of things. It's got the elite jobs, the entertainers, biotrophies, and maintenance drones, which is a lot more than just when it was entertainers. So for a 20% decrease to all these jobs, I think it's just too much. Even if it's a -2, I mean, you would have to make this like a -3 or -4 for it to be even considered above F tier, in my opinion. And even then, I probably wouldn't put it higher than like a C tier at that point. Up next, we have slow breeders. This is an F tier, a -2 cost for -10% population growth. I wouldn't want to risk slowing down any population growth at all, as increasing pops is probably one of the most important things you could do in this game to get more resources, more armies, more everything. At 2 points, I think this is just not a deserved nerf. I think it needs to be a little bit higher for it to come out of F tier, but that's just my opinion. Unruly, we have at a C tier, -2 trait points for a +10 emperor size from pops. Keep in mind, this is going to add to your tech costs and tradition costs, which is ultimately going to hold you back from progressing in the game. This is likely going to add anywhere from 50 to 100 empire size endgame, depending on how much population you have built up at that point. I'm not sure if I would want to risk adding more empire size. It would slow down the progress a bit too much. If you're 10% or more behind other players on progressing your tech and traditions, you're just going to be at a huge disadvantage. So at most, this is a C tier. Up next, we have acidic vascularity. This looks really weird, and it only belongs to 2 species, the necroids and the toxoids. But imagine combining this with spare organs. That would be pretty insane. Reanimated bombs combining for enemy armies. Army fights at that point become at most a 2-for-1 exchange for the enemy. It seems like it could be strong, but the purge pop output right here with a -75% could be pretty big. So at this point, I would recommend not taking purge pops if you have that option. Acidic vascularity is a B tier. Camouflage. It's basically combining natural physicists, although reduced to 10% instead of a 20%, and a 20% army health boon. No other traits add army health except chromalogs, which is a 4 cost, and it gives 40%. So for a 1 cost to give 20% plus physicist efficiency, that's really strong, and it's only 1 cost. However, it only applies to these 3 species, so keep that in mind. I am placing this at an A tier. Up next, we have Phototropic. This is a C tier. This is a very nuanced pick in some builds, but I personally don't like the idea of not hedging your resources in one way or another. You're replacing 50% of your food or mineral upkeep with more energy credits. So you're basically just putting more emphasis on energy rather than food. It doesn't completely get rid of food. That's the problem. If it got completely rid of food and you could focus on just energy, that'd be a different story. But food is very easy to come by, and it's very easy to build. It could be good if you want to go a heavy energy route, but since the food isn't completely removed, I just don't place it as higher. If the food was 100% removed, or even if it had a ratio, like, oh, replace 100% of your food for 50 or 150% more energy credits, I would even take that too, instead of just having to worry about food and energy credits. I'd rather have to just get rid of food entirely. That would be a sweet deal, and that would probably move up even to like A or B tier, depending on the build. But in this case, we are going to place it as C tier. Up next, we have Aquatic. This is going to be a B tier. If you are going Ocean Paradise Origin, this is a no-brainer and becomes an S build, or an S tier. Otherwise, for most other builds, it's going to become a B tier because the negatives that you get from non-wet worlds, which is entirely possible in a normal start game, you're gonna suffer with these things down here. Minus or plus 30% housing usage and minus 20% habitability. Those are some pretty big nerfs. So just something to consider. More habitability, less housing usage, and more job efficiency here. It's all great stuff. Up next, we have Budding. I'm putting this at a B tier. This is the same idea as Crystallization, but it's for fungoid and plantoid species. The scaling here is a lot better. For every 100 pops, you get 0.02 monthly population growth. This also stacks with other things such as clone VADs or spawning drone. The interesting thing here is that it's a monthly organic population growth instead of just some random strategic resource. So I do like that, although if you think about it, if you have 10,000 pops, that's only, 2% monthly population growth. So not a lot, but it can add up, especially late game. Cranial Hypertrophy. This is part of the new DLC Shadows of the Shroud, which just came out in the 4.1 Lyra update. So with that being said, this isn't something I've personally tried, but based off what I'm seeing here, I'm going to place this as a low B tier. And the reason why it's a low B tier is this is fantastic. 15% job efficiency for research jobs is great, but a minus 10% for worker and menial drones. There's more worker and menial drone jobs than there are research jobs, depending on how you build your games. But for the most part, 98% of people are going to have more worker and menial drones. So yes, you are impacting a very important resource here. You're also hitting something that's a pretty massive part of your civilization. So with that being said, low B tier, but I do like how it does give a good amount of job efficiency for all research jobs. Up next, we have Crystallization. I'm putting this as a B tier. Every 100 pops, you get 0.02 monthly population growth, but it only applies to lithoid species. So pretty much the same thing as Budding, but for the lithoids. So with that being said, same thing occurs here. Every 10,000, you're going to get, 2% monthly population growth. Not bad, but depending on how many pops you have towards the end of the game, this can be pretty impactful. So it's a B tier. Up next, we have Egg Laying. I'm putting this as a B tier. I find this one to be good, but not great. If it was a 1 cost, it would be much higher. But the problem with this is that every planet needs a food surplus, not the whole empire. You know how your whole empire covers all deficiencies with every other planet? If you have like one planet dedicated to food or one planet dedicated to energy, they'll cover each other. In this case, it's living on a planet with a local food or mineral surplus. So it's not empire-wide. If you have planets dedicated and specializing in certain goods or production, this might not be the best thing for you, but quite honestly, you should be specializing planets based on whatever natural resources are on there or whatever natural traits are coming off the planet. This is going to be ideal for tall builds with low amounts of planets or colonies, since you're going to only have a few planets anyways, and so every planet's going to need to build food. If you can get that, probably B tier, but otherwise, if you're building wide, it's probably going to be like a C, more likely a D tier, like a high D tier. Up next, we have Familial. This is B tier. I would place this higher, but the scaling is what's holding this back. You need 20,000 population with this trait, with this specific trait. It doesn't apply to all populations in your empire. It applies to only the the ones that have this trait, to get the full effect, which is already difficult enough to do. If you have migration treaties or other species on your planet, you'll want to avoid this one because you're just losing efficiency at this point. This is a great one to take on tall builds or large Gaia world starts that have planet size of 30. And you also want to be someone who's only having species with this trait, so likely you're probably going to be isolationist or xenophobic. Just note that happiness is a very strong thing, and it helps out with output, less crime, stability, and more. If you're going tall isolationist, xenophobic, or what, something along those lines, basically to not intermingle with other migration treaties or keeping other populations on your planet, this is a no-brainer. B tier, edging towards A tier. Up next we have flight. I'm putting this C tier. It is a 2 cost with army damage taken minus 30%, and your effective commander level is +1. This only applies to avian and anthropoid species, so keep that in mind. These aren't bad things, but considering when army damage actually comes into play, it's not great. And the commander skill level is nice, but it's also not really something that you're using until you're actively fighting. So that's why I'm placing this as a C tier. I wouldn't personally say it's worth it at this cost, but it's also not a terrible choice. If you plan on fighting a lot, this could be a good selection for you though. Up next we have Gaseous Byproducts. For every 100 pop that's working as a slave or better produces 0.01 exotic gas. That means every 10,000 is only going to produce 1 exotic gas per month. For a 2 cost, I would say that's a high price to pay for something that could be bought for some trade currency on the market on a monthly basis. I personally don't find this worth it. I'm putting it at D tier. Up next we have Invasive Species. You have to spend 2 points in order to get this, and it scales based off negative traits, which is interesting. I could see this being potentially good, but you're locked into only negative traits or botanical traits at this point, which makes it a C tier. And I'm sure with the right min-max build, this could possibly be S tier. But for most players, it's going to be pretty mid. You really have to min-max a build in order to get the most out of this. The habit of building the pop growth is going to be really good, but you have to be very selective on which negative traits you actually choose, because that is going to be very difficult to balance around. And also keep in mind, it only applies to fungoid and plantoid species. Up next, we have Radiotrophic, and I'm placing this as a conditional A tier. And the reason why it's conditional A tier is that if you can get a Tomb World start like a post-apocalyptic origin, this is going to be really strong A tier. Otherwise, it's probably a high D tier. Maybe a low C tier. You might be able to make the case for it. You're removing your hedging by decreasing the amount of food and increasing your energy credit upkeep. However, this energy credit upkeep is removed for populations living on Tomb World, which is why it's a conditional A tier. This whole thing depends on your species living on a Tomb World, because you get more population growth speed and you also get Tomb World habitability increase. Another thing to keep in mind is that it only applies to fungoid, plantoid, and lithoid species. Up next we have Scintillating Skin. This is the same thing as Volatile Excretions, every 100 pops, 0.01 rare crystals. For something that you could buy for a few trade credits and make it a monthly purchase, you'd be pretty much getting this, but this is going to cost you 2 trait points. So in my opinion, not worth it. It's a D tier. Up next, we have Seasonal Dormancy. Seasonal Dormancy is C tier, a reduction on the population upkeep, depending on their employment status. Not a bad choice, but at a 2 cost, I'm not sure if I'd find it worth it. At a minimum, you're getting 15%, but at the maximum, you get 75%. This only applies to mammalian and reptilian species. Up next, we have Spare Organs. This is a D tier. I think for a 2 cost, the perks are not amazing, and the leaders dying are just off a scaling probability. Leaders will survive their first death. So basically, the game is going to figure out, okay, is this leader going to die right now? And there's a certain percentage at a given age if they're going to die or not. It doesn't mean that their life is extended twice as long. It just means that the first probability on which they roll a bad roll, like a nat 1, I'm not saying it's a nat 1 on a nat versus a nat 20, but imagine if it was a nat 1, then they would die, but in this case they wouldn't. Offensive army death replacement can be a neat trick, but I still don't think this is worth 2 costs. The livestock output is nice, but also food's like the least desirable resource and is often easily replaced, so this isn't really a big deal. But if you remember what I said earlier, if you combine Spare Organs with acidic vascularity, That's going to be pretty cool because armies explode on death for 250 damage. Offensive army death, there's a 20% chance of spawning a replacement army. Keep in mind, it only applies to musculoid, necroid, and toxoid species. So going back here, you also have necroid and toxoid species. So there is some overlap between these two, but only for 2 species here and 3 species back at the spirit organs. So this does work. If you use spirit organs with acidic vascularity, this probably moves up to like a B tier, if not A tier. Just based off the army thing alone, you'll be able to conquer planets extremely easily with this setup. Up next, Volatile Excretions. This also falls in the other things that have this scaling thing going on. I just don't believe that this is worth it. It's a D tier in my opinion. For every 10,000 population, you're gonna produce 1 mote per month. I think for a 2 cost, that's really high. They need to increase the scaling and reduce the cost for this to be worth it, especially with how often you can find stuff on the map, or you could just give it a monthly trade to cover that cost. Up next, we have Genetic Memory. Only applies to these 3 species here, but habitability is scaling from colony age of, from the start with a 0.5 per year to a max of 25. So after 50 years, you'll have an increased habitability. I'm putting this at a B tier. I do think that the cost is a bit high for a scaling habitability perk. The description is a bit confusing, but the way I understand it is that you get the max habitability after 50 years. This can work well with other perks that give boons based off habitability, and especially for stuff that gives perks for over 100% habitability. Not a great pick if you're looking to rush things, but it's a great pick for mid and late game. Up next, we have Shelled, putting this at B tier. You get a minus 75% housing usage and a 10% habitability. Note that this only applies to musculoid and necroid species. At a 3 cost, the perks are pretty good. I want to place this higher, but I think the cost is dragging it down. I think if it gave higher habitability, I would place it in a higher tier. The housing usage, it's not terrible, and at that point, with the 75%, that's a pretty big impact. You're going to be saving a good amount of building slots that might be dedicated to housing, or city districts that would be dedicated to housing and now could be dedicated to something else, which is why I do think this is a B tier. Up next, we have Uncanny Intuition. This is also part of the new Shroud DLC. For a 3 cost, your counselor skill is +2. And keep in mind, you have to have the psionic trait in order to get this. With the 3 cost, I do feel like that's pretty high. But for +2 in skills, and keep in mind this only applies to counselors, so it doesn't apply to commanders or scientists, only counselors. I want to say it's like a low B tier, high C tier. So somewhere in between there. For now, I'm going to say low B tier. I'm just a bit thrown off with the high cost. I think if this was like a 2 cost, probably be A tier. But given how specific this is, especially you have to have psionics, I don't see a lot of people taking this, but it can be really good. I could see in some builds this could be really good and have some really strong leaders with this. Up next, we have Chroma Logs. Chroma Logs I'm putting at a C tier. This is a 4 cost. 4 cost is really high. Now, what do you get with the 4 cost? You get 40% army health. That's huge. Remember, the only other army health that we get is from camouflage. If we look back, camouflage gives 20% army health. There's nothing else that gives army health in the game in terms of traits for organics. If I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments. You also get a 50% governing ethics attraction, so more people are going to like you, more higher unity, all that good stuff. More higher job efficiency for physicists and bureaucrats, so more unity and more physicist research. Again, I think this is C tier. I think that 4 cost is way too high. I get that it's combining a few 1 cost traits, so you're effectively combining a bunch of traits, so you're reducing your pick amounts if you were going for these in the first place. That's great. But if you're not, I just don't think that it's worth it. And also keep in mind, it's limited to 3 species down here. The boons are nice, but they're not game altering in any way. And so I'm just going to keep it at a C tier. Up next, we have Cranial Megatrophy. So if we remember, we had a Cranial Hypertrophy, and now we have Cranial Megatrophy. So that was a 2 for 15%, and now we have a 4 for 25. So there's actually a reduction here going on. With that being said, I'm actually going to place this as a C tier. This is fantastic. Love this all day every day. 25%, that's huge. But this is a huge hit too. And it's a 4 cost. That's huge. It's honestly, it's almost leaning D tier, but I'm going to keep it C tier because I could see this still being very helpful for tech rushes. Although tech rushes are not really strong anymore, or at least they've been nerfed. I shouldn't say they're not strong. They've just been nerfed. But I think this is a way to kind of bring them back. But again, you're going to be getting hit with a 20% decrease. That's really big. If this was 30, like if they kept the same scaling and this was 30 instead of 25, because the previous one was 15, you know, maybe we're looking at a high C tier, maybe low B tier, but it's just, they cut it here. They cut this, and I just don't think that's worth it. Up next, we have the Spatial Mastery. So, massive forecasts. We just gone through a bunch of forecasts. Effective leader skill, +1. So, it says leader. So that means it applies to counselors, commanders, scientists. Really good. Army damage taken, -50%. That's a pretty big impact. And your population housing usage is -15%. Note that it only applies to these 2 species. I'm putting it a B tier. The leader skill level +1 is nice. Army damage also. All these things are really nice. I think it would be higher if it was a 3 cost, but I'm still giving this B tier just because all these are really good things to have. Up next, we have Permeable Skin. I'm putting this as a B tier. A -1 trait that gives -20% habitability if you're on a different climate category than what your civilization is used to. With that being said, what does that mean? So, you know, wet is continental, ocean, tropical. You have the dry, arid, desert, savanna, and then cold is alpine, arctic, tundra. You know, if you're United Nations of Earth, you want a wet climate, which is continental, ocean, and tropical, with your preference being continental. But if you go on a planet that is, say, alpine or arid, you're going to get a -20% habitability. If you're building tall, or you're combining this with some sort of Gaia World start, this is probably going to be a really good thing. Probably higher than a B tier. I would say A tier, not quite S, but probably A tier. But do keep in mind, it only applies to these 2 species. Part of the DLC Shadows of the Shroud, we got the Haunted Visions. So -2 trait gives a -10% job efficiency for elites and -10% for specialists in complex drones. Quite honestly, I'm going to put this at a D tier. I think, you know, any job inefficiency for these, especially these jobs, is going to be huge. So I'm putting this as a D tier. It is nice that they're giving you a -2, but I wouldn't want to take the hit on the output loss for this. Up next, we have the Nascent Stage. Keep in mind, it only applies to these 4 species. So newly grown pops with this trait spend the first 5 years after being grown as a pre-sapient. So what does that mean? Your pops are effectively useless for the first 5 years of life, but they still have the upkeep of a pop. I'll admit, it sounds bad on paper. Your pops are still uplifted, but it takes 5 years. This means that any rush builds, this is going to work well. And also keep in mind, this is going to apply to any pops that are after the initial pops that you already start. I do think that this is C tier. I think that this is a trait that most people aren't going to realize that it's not something that's going to hurt them noticeably. You're going to see like an uptick in upkeep, but after 5 years, then they're going to become a normal population and do their own thing. So it's almost like you have to wait 5 years for your population to actually be activated in a sense. So this is probably going to go well with civilizations that are trying to become friends with everyone and don't start wars, because you're going to want to have to worry about upkeeping your pre-sapient populations. Up next, a -3 cost for 0.5 population amenities usage. I'm putting this as a C tier. I think 0.5 is going to add up quickly and can spiral out of control with low stability and uprisings and all that bad stuff. This might mean you have to dedicate another spot on your worlds to, you know, amenities generations, which could have been used another spot for research or whatever you have in mind. However, it is a -3 trait, which is also really hard to pass up. So if you can manage the amenities and you know how planet management works properly, this is not a bad choice, but it also only applies to lithoid and necroid species, so keep that in mind. Up next, we got Hollow Bones. For a 3 cost, job efficiency for workers are -0.67. So if you have a planet size of 10, it's going to be job efficiency minus 6.67%. And then you double that if it's the size 20, and then you triple that if it's the size 30. So you get the idea. I personally think it's not worth it, especially if you want to build wide and you're getting a bunch of planets, or if you have a large world start, probably not worth it. But if you can get some planets that are small in size, because this trait scales with planet size, it could be good. I'm placing the C tier because I'm also curious if this would work with habitats. If it works with habitats, this is going to be like a no-brainer, and it's probably like A or S tier, quite honestly. For a -3, it's probably A or S tier. Because habitats are, really small in size, and so the hit that you get from that, it's not going to be a lot. This would also make like crazy synergy for Void Dweller's Origin too, if it actually worked for habitats. And lastly, we have Rooted. I'm putting this as an S tier, and this is a conditional S tier, assuming you are playing with the tall build. But if you're going wide, this immediately goes to F tier, because you're going to make your game a living hell with micromanaging, trying to get populations to resettle, because populations will not automatically resettle, and the cost is 200%. That's huge. If you're playing tall, this isn't going to be an issue at all, and you're going to get a -3 trait points. It's a huge win. However, it only applies to fungal and plantoid species, so keep that in mind. Well, that's all we got for this video. Keep in mind, this only covered traits for organics. We'll do a separate video that covers the traits of machines. As you can see here, there's a bunch of traits that we've got to go over for machines, and it's quite different than organics. So if you found that this video helped you, greatly appreciate a like. If you want to see more content like this, I'd love to subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. And as always, I'll see you guys next time, and have a good one.